Memories of a World War II Childhood by Patricia Stuart. Read by Patricia Stuart.
The Second World War started on the 3rd of September 1939. I was 3 years old and 8 months. I was born on the 14th of January 1936. Patricia May Ann Blight. My brother, John Farnham Blight, had been born on the 19th of June 1927. Frederick James Blight and my mother, Bridget Blight, née Kennedy, lived in a small flat on Grand Parade above shops in Green Lanes, Haringey, Tottenham. The street door was beside a shop with a steep flight of stairs into the living space. My mother fell down those stairs when 7 months pregnant and gave birth to me prematurely. Despite my sudden and dramatic arrival at a dangerous time for premature birth, I survived, and a strong survival instinct that is still with me had its first outing. I slept on the smallest top drawer of the dressing table in my parents' bedroom. I was too tiny to rest in the crib, saved from my brother's infancy. Early in my life, Mum and I were in hospital in different wards with diphtheria, which was an infectious illness which often resulted in death. We managed to survive that crisis too. My family disputed I could remember, saying I was too young. But I do, however, remember, and I was inside some kind of oxygen tent. My dad looked at me through what must have been a cellophane window, for plastic was not invented. Diphtheria immunisation for London children was very sporadic. Hackney did not start immunisation programmes until 1937-38. Despite a vaccine being available from 1927. The flat had big windows with crossed brown paper stuck onto them, a recommended way to stop blasts from breaking windows. And I recall how our triangles made it quite hard to see out of our front windows for me to watch the people shopping in the street below. Front windows looked over Green Lanes, and the trolley bus wires took trolley buses towards Finsbury Park, which was not far away. The opposite side took buses towards Wood Green. My first memories are big windows and trolley buses. My brother John would run errands for neighbours along the Grand Parade. When he was paid, he would buy sausages, or, if he did really well, he would get fish and chips for supper. The family purse depended on that young boy's efforts. There is a photograph, alas lost, of John washing me in a big enamel bowl and me yelling and him looking very fed up. The arrival of a sister after being an only child for a while must have been a shock for him. Our age differences were always a problem for us both. Separation from each other and from our parents due to war and evacuation was no doubt a factor in our difficulty to really bond. Sadly, sibling closeness did not really happen until much later in our lives. The East End of London and the Dock were targets and badly affected with loss of life and homes. One big scare was that there would be wide-scale gas attacks. Everyone carried a gas mask. Even small babies were encased in gas mask incubators, where they often cried and misted up the transparent window. Gas masks for children were in the shape of a Mickey Mouse or Goofy. No one was fooled. It was a horrible thing to have to wear. And practice sessions of gas mask procedures were rehearsed in case gas was sent to London streets. My dad had suffered from gas attacks during the First World War. and he was concerned, so our family had to wear the gas masks more often than other people. And we had family practice even when there was no air raid warning. One thing about the gas mask, we had to spit on the visor, and spitting on it I quite enjoyed. Apparently this would enable us to see through the visor and stop it misting up. Mine always misted up, and the rubber was really sticky and smelly, and it made you hot all around your face and hairline. I hated the gas mask, and I did not understand what gas was or what a gas attack really meant. How John and I disliked it. Mum wore hers washing up in the scullery, and she used swear words because you couldn't see what she was doing. Your dad Hitler won't wash up the dishes, so I must. The scullery was a small area of the kitchen where there was a big butler sink, where shelves above for pots and pans, etc. No washing up liquids. She just had a small wire box on the end of a handle, and all soap pieces were squashed into it, and this implement was swished into the water to help clean the dishes, plus some washing soda. On the shelves, I remember, were candle holders and lots of candles and matchboxes, as we did not have any electricity or gas mantles in the scullery. Under the butler sink were pails and scrubbing brushes, but also a bowl which had all our toilet soap and flannels and toothbrushes, as we did not have a bathroom and we used the scullery sink to wash. There was a big roll of towel on the back door of the scullery, which was used by all and only washed about once a week because it was very grey shades. We had a metal safe that hung from the ceiling in the scullery, and our meat ration was in it to keep cool. The aims of the Third Reich caused much suffering, and the added cruelty and horror of persecution of the Jewish and Gypsy populations in the countries they occupied was news later received with revulsion and disbelief. My parents scanned the newspapers and listened to the wireless for news of the war in Europe. All over Europe, the armies of Nazi Germany were marching onward in a seemingly unstoppable strength. The mystery of politics and religious attitude. With the discussions and the arguments that took place between my dad and his fellow firemen and other friends on politics and religious belief, I started to interest myself in the mysterious adult world of deeply held conflicting ideas. My aunts were into various styles of religion, ranging from C of E, Anglican, to Christian Science and spiritualism. My mother was a lapsed Roman Catholic with a real fear of the Catholic Church. Priests especially, should they be Irish, were to be greatly feared. During air raids, however, she would drop to her knees and say, "Hail Mary, Mother of Grace," and the Lord's Prayer. This was quite alarming for me to see. My dad was what he termed an agnostic, as nothing he could be proved to convince him, but he was interested in all the various faiths. So therefore, for me, religion was a mysterious subject. I was baptised into the Anglican Church because friends of my mum wanted to be a grandparents. I've never met those grandparents, but I do know that their names were Lorna and George. I made my own decision on faith and religion as an adult, and I love the church service and hymns of the Anglican Church. I still have a faith in God and his purpose for me. As I absorbed these conflicting religious views and strange political events in Europe, I was at times frightened and confused, but also interested that grown-up people should be so angry with each other. Hitler and Mussolini were bad men. Uncle Joe Stalin and Churchill were good men. After the war, Hitler and Mussolini stayed bad men, but Uncle Joe Stalin stopped being Uncle Joe and joined the bad men in everyone's opinion. My dad considered himself to be a socialist, and he therefore voted Labour. During the war, he was a great follower and admirer of Mr. Winston Churchill, who was also known affectionately as Winnie. The first election after the war ended, he went back to be his Labour vote, and he then voted in Mr. Clement Attlee. He then turned away from Winnie, who was the Conservatives' candidate. He really confused the young me with his turnaround of political viewpoint. As an adult, I questioned my dad on his political views. He had books by Karl Marx and also works by Lenin. One book by Robert Tressel was called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, which was all about class war. Despite these books, he maintained he was not a communist, but a socialist. I still cannot work out the difference. Labour was the nearest party to his idea of socialism. My brother was 9.5 years older than me. His school was evacuated to Wales in 1940, and I went with him. At that time, I would have been just over 4 years old. I have no idea how I was allowed to join a school evacuation before I myself was in school. Maybe my parents pulled official strings. My mother was pretty good at string pulling. Our parents thought we would stay together. However, as John was of school age and I was preschool age, we were separated by the billeting authorities. This was hard for John. He had promised to look after me. What could a young lad do against the power of adult authority? Some of John's experience at that time could have been more traumatic than mine. I did not have any guilt to contend with at that time. John was billeted in Trafford, and we did not see each other all the time we were in Wales. I presume that he was kept with his classmates and billeted near to wherever he would be educated. I have looked up Trafford on the map, and it is just about above Pontypridd where I was billeted, and there does appear to be a river running between the two place names. How insensitive, they were so near, but they never ever brought us to see each other. I wish now I had asked him or my parents details of his evacuation story. I was billeted with a mining family. Mr. Roberts and his 4 grown sons were miners. Miners did not go into the army. They were needed in the coal mines. That was called a reserved occupation. Young men could be conscripted to go to work in the mines, and they were called Bevan boys after Mr. Anuran Bevan, who was the minister in charge of such conscriptions. My husband Tom was called upon to go into the mines, but Tom decided he would go and ask his mother for permission to join the Royal Navy instead, and he became a sailor at the age of 17, determined not to become another Bevan boy. Mrs. Roberts was a kind lady. She was happy to have a little girl to look after having 4 sons. She wore a clean pinafore apron all day and every day. They were a very poor family who looked after me as if I was their own child. They had a brown dog called Nigger. No political correctness in those days. Nigger had puppies, and I was allowed to choose one, and they called her Patsy to remind them of me when I went home to London. That basket of puppies is a very strong memory. Warm puppy of my own to cuddle was such a treat. There were chickens in the yard, and I would feed them. Mrs. Roberts would collect eggs sometimes, and I would have one for my tea, followed by a cornflour blancmange in a cup. Cornflour blancmange every night. I have a memory of a life filled with cornflour blancmange, perhaps to make me have my ration of milk. She baked potatoes and scooped the middle. She mashed it up with butter and then she put it all back into the potato, and I would eat it with a spoon like a boiled egg. I remember those tea times so clearly because eggs were on ration and many people kept chickens to supplement the ration book quota. Dried egg was available. I learnt to bake cakes by reconstituting eggs later on at secondary school. Egg powder mixed with water. Bath time in the miner's home. Mrs. Roberts filled the tin bath in front of the coal fire. One by one the men got into the bath. She washed their backs clean from all the coal dust. I remember the water was heated in a big black kettles which sat on the black lead range. The men did not wear shirts in the mines while they were working because of the heat. There were no pithead baths for them to wash before they came home from work. So I had my tea washing a show of filling and emptying of a tin bath. The bath hung on a nail in the yard by day and was carried indoors to the fire for the men's bath time. So I saw white bottoms as they went down into the tin bath, with big towels were wrapped around each of them as they came out of the bath. This was very discreetly done, so that I never ever saw their respective manhoods. For a while, white bottoms were probably enough for me to gaze on at that time in my life. My bath was the sink in the scullery. My hair was washed in something called green soap, which was bought at a chemist or the oil shop, and it was like green jelly because there were not many shampoos during the war. In this modern age of hot and cold water on tap, it sounds very primitive, but I was given a very special kind of caring love, and as the Beatles sang later, all you need is love. Mrs. Roberts gave love freely to the men of her family and to me, a little girl from home and family. So when I hear a Welsh male voice choir, I can picture those miners with the lamps on their heads shining out. I stayed with these lovely, warm people and kind people for a short interval in my life. I bless them to the day for all they gave up to make a small child safe. I've never forgotten them, and I left Patsy the puppy and that home. No doubt there were tears all around. When I was 5, I had to leave that billet. I have no memory where I was billeted, but I understand from the family that once I was of school age, Mrs. Roberts couldn't keep me at Pontypridd. So I was sent to an infant school in Hertfordshire with no recall at all. I have no memory of that. When my brother was 14 years, it was time for him to leave school and return to London. So therefore, I was sent back with him. Because I went with him, I had to go back with him. When John saw me at the station, he cried. And I remember that because he seemed to be too big a boy to cry. We had not been together or seen each other all the time we were in Wales, and I think he was unhappy that he had been unable to stay with me as he had promised our mum. Many children did return to London because mothers and children were sad and wanted each other. Not too many bombs were falling at first, and homesickness brought many children back to the dangers of the blitz. There were posters telling mothers to leave the children where they are. But with their men at war overseas, that message was often ignored. When London children had to leave, the schools were closed and they were used for other purposes. ambulance stations, warden posts, and some were used to house people who had been bombed out and had lost their homes. West Green Road School, I know, was a cafeteria for hot meals, because later on John often took me there to get cheap dinners for us both. I was evacuated from Woodlands Park School. My first official school was Woodlands Park Infants Junior School, and I was not there long before we were evacuated again. These lists and instructions I have taken from the official London County Council forms. Each child had to be labelled, one label to be worn loosely round the neck and tucked under the upper garment. The other label was to be fixed to the child's luggage. Mum had a list to let her know what to pack in the way of food. Sandwiches, egg or cheese, packs of seedless raisins, plain biscuits, barley sugar, no chocolate, 1 apple, no liquids. Liquids were not to be included because all drink containers were glass. Plastic had not been invented. How did they manage without plastic food containers, etc.? The adults would come with us, were instructed to bring water. Brown bags were suggested to aid children subject to travel sickness. We had to practice walking in crocodile twos along the road and had to carry our own little rucksacks or pillowcases. We had our gas masks and ration book and identity cards. We recited our names and addresses and birth dates so we knew who we were and where we had come from. No one, not even our parents, knew where we would be going, and we all thought we were going to be on something like a Sunday school outing. A list of what each child had to take with them. Each child had to take a rucksack or a pillowcase with a tape through the top hem. I had a pillowcase, and I even sewed the hem and threaded the tape through it myself. My auntie Hilda helped me, and she embroidered my name in coloured embroidery silks with a little flower for a full stop. We had to have a change of underclothes, vest, knickers and Liberty bodice. Liberty bodices were worn by girls and boys in the colder months and were like a padded waistcoat with rubber buttons on down the front. Liberty bodices were worn over vests and under top clothes, and the girls had suspenders to attach to the rubber buttons on the lower edge of the Liberty bodice so they could keep up their brown or black woolen stockings. Boys suffered in the cold as short trousers were worn winter and summer. Boys did not wear long trousers until they were 12 years old, and older still if parents could not really afford the expense of long trousers. It was a really big event when a boy went into longs. I can remember young boys in the winter having the inside of their thighs below the start of the short trousers chapped red wool. They wore long socks held up with green garters. Girls did not wear trousers or long socks. We had the instructions on the list to take a warm top coat, 2 jumpers, 2 skirts for girls, 2 pairs of trousers for the boys. Girls had pixie hats, 2 square pieces of cloth sewn together with 2 cords at the neck edge. And I did have a couple of pixie hats my mum had made, but took on evacuation 4 berets and 4 linen caps to wear under the berets because I had had ringworm on the scalp and I was totally bald. Ringworm was common in schools at that time, and the treatment via the clinic was to dab on a substance called gentian violet and send the kids back to class. bright violet blue areas on children's marked them out as mini lepers. The treatment neither cured those afflicted nor prevented infection from spreading through the schools. And I was just unlucky because I got ringworm in the scalp. Nowadays, ringworm is easily cured with antibiotic creams. Mum took the expensive step of taking me to St John's Hospital for skin diseases and got treatment for the extensive infection. National Health Service was not in evidence and all treatment had to be paid for. The treatment was drastic and it made all my hair fall out. Baldness gave much heartbreak when the evacuation orders said I had to go. My hair fell away rapidly and I do wonder what they did to my scalp. Ray treatment perhaps, and no doubt a dangerous remedy for a child's head infected with a parasitic infection. Scabies, also highly infectious, was treated in the same offhand manner at that time with the application of gentian violet. No doubt because we were in a poor area, the clinics did their best and many parents could not afford to pay for treatment. A bald little girl wearing a linen cap and a woolen beret. My dad told me, just smile all the time and nobody would notice my lack of hair. You are more important than your head, he preached. I found this quite hard to accept, as he had a thick curly head of hair and would have hated to have lost it. My dad died in his middle 60s, still with a really good head of curly hair. English countryside, here we come. Children often went to relatives with their mothers and did not travel in school evacuation party. Many country aunts and uncles took in their nieces and nephews for duration of the war. It must have been much better to go to a family member. My mother was Irish and her sister May and her husband lived in Southern Ireland and tried to persuade my parents to send me to Ayr, which was neutral during the war. This was not then allowed for some reason. Mum would have found it hard for me to have gone to Ireland. To be torn between one's child's safety and the need to have them within reach must have been a dilemma. At the distance of our 70 years and proud mother, grandmother and great-grandmother, I feel compassion for the quandary of my dearly loved and remembered mother and the situation that they were both in. Relatives in Ireland had never seen me, but they had seen my brother John. My mother and her sister were very close. They were very alike, facially and vocally, with the soft southern Irish accent. My mother was slim, my aunt was plump. I was told how like my auntie I was and how much I reminded Mum of her sister. So I now know where my round shape comes from. It comes from my plump Irish Auntie May. Mum and Auntie May were orphans. May was 4 years old and Mum was 2 years old when they were taken into a Catholic orphanage that was run by nuns. My grandparents, Anne Kennedy and John Kennedy, both died in their 20s from tuberculosis. TB was the scourge for the poor in Rathmines, County Dublin. Life was very hard for those two little sisters at the orphanage, and I understand from Mum's tales the nuns were very severe, but at least they stayed together. Because they were orphans and their parents were married, they were allowed to be together. If they had not had parents who were married, they would have been separated. Orphan girls were sent into service by 12 years of age, and May went to work as a scullery maid, leaving my mother for a while. My mother then decided she would not stay long in service and left as soon as she could to become a barmaid and waitress before she was 16. My mother died at the age of 60. Always wary of the Roman Catholic Church, she lies at peace with her sister in Mount Jerome Cemetery in Dublin, home in Ireland where her heart had always been. Finding the tough side of evacuation. War to me was an exciting adventure, travel to faraway places of England, not the horror that it really was. And I was to learn a lesson that not everyone loved me. All through life I have wanted people not only to like me, but also to excuse my mistakes and shortcomings. On the whole, I try to make sure I have respect and friendliness towards all people I meet, until of course they give me real cause to change my feelings towards them. The huge, hurried evacuation of the young children from London resulted from the heavy bombing of the East End and the areas around the London docks. The bombers flew down the Thames to the port of London, and old Father Thames gave them a helping hand because it guided them to their destination to wreak awful loss of life and property. Children shipped out to Canada were all killed when the ship carrying them to safety was sunk in the English Channel. We left from our school with our labels and our gas masks. How brave we were. It's really hard to believe that it did happen to so many very young and vulnerable children. How would present-day parents and children cope if faced with such brutal separation? The partings were hard and parents had to put a brave face on a heartbreaking event. Goodbye, Mum. My mother told me to be a good girl and eat up all your greens. A mystery to me, because I always did eat up all my greens. In our house, if you did not eat what was on your plate, you did not get a pudding. And Mum's puddings were a treat never to be missed. Treacle tarts, spotted dick, jam roly-poly, which were made of suet and steam for ages. Bread pudding was a favourite, and macaroni and rice puddings with sultanas were good too. She made lots of plum puddings from the bottled plums she stored in Kilner jars in my wardrobe for some unknown reason. We did eat a lot of plums, and my heat bumps in the summer were always blamed on the stone fruit, but I'm sure now they were insect bites. She was a really good cook and a wonderful manager of the rations. Mum never ever measured or weighed or anything. It was just a bit of this and a bit of that, and wonderful success that I have never achieved despite scales and Delia Smith. Only a fussy eater would leave any of her Irish stew, toad in the hole, rissoles, or the colcannon bacon and cabbage that other children did not seem to know about. After the war, my mother was the cook at a school for the deaf, which was near to the secondary school that I went to in 1947. She made loads of puddings there, and I remember bakewell tarts that she cooked on huge trays because we often had leftovers for our tea on bakewell tart day. Strange now that I am very deaf, because she was so good to those deaf children so long ago. On a train, and no one knew where we were going to go. The first stop was Manchester. Being on a train was exciting at first, then it got very boring. We were on that train for hours and hours, and we all ate our sandwiches long before we should. In Manchester, we were taken to a hall and given soup and sandwiches and fairy cakes. It's funny to remember that. because I still list foods now. Maybe that's a throwback to when I was little. I'm not sure when you would eat, and it became very important to you. There were strange straw mattresses on the floor, and we were told we were going to sleep on them until we were chosen by a host family. I remember we kids were okay. We'd seen bombers flying overhead to the East End, and we knew that bombs dropped. But that night the German planes bombed the Manchester Ship Canal, and these grown-ups were running around like frightened chickens. We were then loaded onto another coach to go to another hall already full of other children, and again we were told that we had to go to sleep. Poor little overtired and dirty from the journey kids. We were frightened, and many were afraid of the dark. Children crying and wanting their mums. I suppose I must have been one of them. It's very hard to sleep on a straw mattress with very little cushions for a pillow. The blankets were grey army blankets and were very rough and scratchy. No cuddles, no drinks of water. How many elderly folk around must have similar stories? I was about 6.5 years old then, and I was only 9.5 at the end of the European War in June 1945. Traumatic events must go very, very deep into a memory. Time softens memory, but it does not let go of frightening times, and that hall is very strong in my memory box. Things like, where's the toilet? Oh, what if I wet the straw mattress? Can I go home? Children excited by the events of the day were shouting and making lots of noise. Suddenly, a door opened at the end of the hall, and a lady with a very loud voice shouted, "All you evacuee children are to be quiet and go to sleep now, because I am a teacher." It's very strange for modern children to believe this, but we were very obedient to the voice of any teacher. The cane and the strap were favoured forms of discipline, even for young children in those days. Teachers were the number one authority, even ahead of dads. I wanted my teddy bear. Mum did post him to me at a later date. Altrincham Collection Centre for Evacuation. We stood on a stage and people came and chose whatever child that they might fancy. It was a bit like a pet shop. Brothers and sisters were often split up as families had set ideas of what they wanted. Some people wanted only girls, some people wanted only boys. Labels were examined, questions were asked. I have no idea what I was asked, but I do know I was not chosen. Not that day, nor for another 4 days. 4 more intakes of London kids arrived, and I was still there. I had had ringworm in the head. The treatment had left me without any hair. I wore my green beret down to my ears. People were allowed to choose, and naturally they chose children with hair who were pretty. And we were just pretty scruffy by the lot by this time, I would expect. It has been found that people took an evacuee to obtain extra rations and for help in the home or local farms. The billeting lady officer took pity on me, and she took me home for a couple of nights with her at her music shop in Altrincham. I liked Altrincham. It reminded me of home. Our family flat that I described earlier was over the top of a music shop in London's Green Lanes, Tottenham. Berry's music shop sold pianos and our front door was next to the shop. I often went into the shop as my parents were friendly with the men who worked in there. In the music shop in Altrincham, I really hoped that the lady would keep me. I was sad and I missed home very much, and I was feeling very hard done by everyone. I hated the idea that John was at home with Mum and Dad and that no one here wanted me at all. And the music shop lady didn't want me to stay either. Eventually, the family who took me lived in Hale in Cheshire. Now, they lived in a big house with a big garden back and front. The road was very long and no flats at all, just houses. And they had a big bathroom with hot water that came out of taps of a wash-hand basin and an enormous bath. We did not have a bathroom at home. In London, we went to the local bathhouse once a week and we paid to have a bath. There you were given a towel, but you had to take your own bar of soap. The towel had LCC stamped on it, and that stood for the London County Council. Baths were in cubicles with latches to shut the doors, hooks where you had to hang your clothes, and a wooden slatted bath mat was all that was in there. When you were ready, you called to the attendant and then they would turn on the water for the main control. Wartime rule was strictly kept. 3 inches of water for children, 5 inches of water for grown-ups. Water was precious because so much was needed by the fire service to put out fires in burning houses and factories that had been bombed. My lack of hair and ignorance made Mrs. X decide, this was her view, that all children, evacuees, had dirty London illnesses, and that I was not to give her daughter any of my London dirty illnesses. It was common that London children were thought to be full of fleas and worse, despite the fact that we were given medical cards to say that we were clear of lice and infection. This was all because I was bored. Mrs. X was a member of the Women's Voluntary Service and she had WVS on her uniform. She sold national savings stamps. The stamps were stuck into books and were there to save for victory. She took me with her and she presented me as the evacuee that she feeds and cares for, alongside her own daughter, who was about my age. I remember that her daughter, not knowing any better, was very spiteful, as only children can be, and she would say to me, "You evacuees all smell because you live in slums. And your mother doesn't want you living with her anymore, so she sent you away." My bed was in a junk room, and it was much too small cot. That was my bed, a cot with bars. I think it was most likely used when the daughter Y was a baby. My legs stuck out through the end of the bars at the end, and I had to pull my legs up to turn over and then poke them back out again. It was very dark because of the blackout, and I was very frightened to call out, and I had chilblains on my toes. I was, and still am, very short, so it was decided that the cot was the best bed for me so that I did not infect Y. To this day, I still poke my feet out of bedclothes at night. The next act was that my bald head had to be washed in black fleece soap every night, and that made it really very sore. This was really stupid because fleas do not live on bald heads. And anyway, it was ringworm I had, not fleas. And this was also why I could not catch any of my London dirty diseases. Mr. X did not go to work. I don't know why, and I do not know what he did for work, but his name was Uncle Bob, and I did not see him very much, but he was a very nice and jolly man, and he was very kind to me. My dad was too old to be enlisted to go to the war. He was a soldier in the First World War. He was in the 316th London Regiment. He was in the expeditionary force which went to France on the 22nd of June 1916, but he was later transferred in November 1916 to Salonika in Greece. He was admitted as a patient in a military field hospital in March 1917 until May 1917, with his medical condition noted as extreme exhaustion. Dad was discharged from the hospital and returned to duty to the sanitary division in December as a rifleman. He was then admitted to hospital again the following October and again in the November with malaria and dysentery. No doubt from working in the sanitary division, heaven only knows what that entailed. He later nearly died through frostbite at one time, and he saw many horrors and lost many friends. Eventually, he was discharged on the 17th of February 1919. Having seen bombings and death at only 17, 18 years of age, with people gassed, it is understandable he did not want his children in London once another war had arrived. Gas was his biggest fear, but that was the one thing that was not dropped on us from the sky. How sad for him to have seen 2 world wars in his lifetime. My blight grandparents had 3 sons, went to the horrors of the trenches. All 3 returned, but with various health problems. I include this for my grandchildren to have this information about their great-grandfather. Much has been written of the suffering of the First World War and the refusal of those who took part to relate their experiences. Much could have been learnt from survivors of the Great War to end all wars. It's just that they all felt really guilty to have survived. But now back to Hale. How could your parents have let you go alone to strangers at so young an age, I have been asked. Because my mother could not come with me. Money was a problem at home. She needed to work so that they could pay their bills. And also, they were unaware of how badly children were sometimes treated by people who felt forced to take on an extra responsibility that they did not want. The distribution of children was according to how many rooms were in any house, and not if the resident wanted or was suitable to take on an evacuee. This was no doubt quite a problem for some rural people. The host families were not investigated as to how they were suited to be foster parents. Then the only thought was ensuring that the children of the nation would survive. And I pray very often that my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren will never find such a situation happening to them or their children. My mum would send me parcels, but I was not allowed to open them. Even my teddy arrived one day, quite by magic. 1 or 2 small items would be given to me, and I was told by Mum that the parcel actually contained many extras that she'd worked hard to send me in London. My sweet ration coupon was swapped for extra sugar rations for my dad's sweet tooth. Being away from home, I thought I was on some kind of punishment for being naughty when I was with my family. Many ex-evacuees have told me they also had this idea. Father Christmas, when he came, gave Y a pillowcase of goodies, but he only left me with a small stocking, and this made me feel that I was very bad. I have no bitterness towards that family, only sadness that they were so shallow and uncaring. They had no idea what the London Blitz was like and what pain we kids had already experienced in our young lives. It's very strange that long ago world, my childhood, now that I write it down, is stirring old memories and tears fall for that little me. When my hair started to grow, it grew in very tight curls. Wow! At that time, there was a poster and it used to advertise a brand of tinned peas which was called Benedict peas. In it, it showed a girl with green peas instead of hair. So, inevitably, I was called Peahead. Children in the school in Hale gave me this nickname, and this name calling made me feel that I wanted to keep my beret on indoors as well as outdoors. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but let me tell you this, names do hurt very, very much. Mum, on a very rare visit, took my beret from me and took it back to London with her. I remember her taking Y and I to have our photograph taken at a shop to make me see that I was not bored anymore. And I still have that photo, the only one taken during that time. I was told I was not to admire myself in the mirror. Poor silly Mrs. X. Hopefully she felt a bit guilt later in her life when she admired herself in mirrors. Mum's occasional visits were special, but she only came for a day by train. Okay, while she was visiting, but back to normal once she went to the station. So why didn't I tell her? Why didn't I tell her how unhappy I was? I do not know. All host families were allowed extra rations and were paid each week, half by parents and half by the government. I was not deprived of my share of rations there and cannot say that I went hungry like some of my school friends did. I had my own ration book right up until 1954 when rationing ended, and I took my ration book on my week's honeymoon to Clacton when I married. I did not miss the thick porridge my mother made for breakfast, which was always made the Irish way with water and salt instead of milk. When I tasted porridge with milk, well, it was the food of the gods. I hardly recall school life in Cheshire, apart from getting badly stung on the back of my leg by a wasp, or more likely a bee, that went poisonous and made me quite ill. The teachers used to have their school dinner with their classes, which I found strange. Was I ever taught anything there? Well, I can tell you this, no maths, that's for sure. The school was not as large as our school in Tottenham, and most of the London children from our school were there. Cheshire children were friendly, as I can remember, and as far as we were concerned, spoke funny. There was a big playing field at the back and a plot where vegetables were planted, in what we then called the school dig for victory garden. Mum comes to my rescue. There were incidents of cruelty to evacuees, and I was fortunate that I was not hit often. But I was beaten with a wet towel when I went to have a bath. I had unfortunately and accidentally killed the family budgerigar. That is a story that even now I cannot write down the full details because it is too painful a memory. The beating has been forgiven. That I was accused of killing a pretty bird on purpose for spite still hurts. The furor alerted a neighbour. A letter was sent to my mother saying she should come home unannounced as I was being ill-treated. In the middle of the night, I was woken up by my own darling mum, who picked me up out of the cot, wrapped me up and took me home to London and the bombs. And I could hear her sitting in that train coming home saying, "If we're all going to go, I'll tell you this, we will all bloody go together." I wish I'd been present when she arrived at that house that evening and let fly with her wonderful fiery Irish temper. Mum had a temper to start anybody's tempers. A few years ago, Tom and I went to a hotel in Hale, and I remembered quite a few buildings and the shops. I told Tom that one statue was not there in my time, and he went away, being typical Tom, and checked, and he found that it had been placed there after the war. We found the school. We also found the church where we went to each Sunday. In fairness, I loved the church and I loved the hymns we sang. Mrs. X was in the choir and had a lovely singing voice. She sang to Y and I in the evenings, and one song that I remember was, "I know why you're crying, I know why you're blue." And later in the song, the good bit, "The war is over for tonight." We couldn't find the house where I was billeted. It seemed very strange to go there, very emotional for me to see the railway station where Mum would arrive on her visits to see me. I'm so glad it's long ago, and I'm really glad I visited because it laid to rest some old ghosts. So I came home and there was no bathroom, there was no hot water from the taps, we did not have a garden. The nearest park was Finsbury Park, which is near Manor House Tube Station. In the park were great barrage balloons, and barrage balloons were like giant grey elephants in the sky, which were supposed to hinder the enemy aircraft. There was a big gun in Finsbury Park, and Dad told me the gun was called Big Bertha. He convinced me that all the loud bangs and the booms were coming from our great friend the gun, Big Bertha, in Finsbury Park. John and I would sit on the steep stairs in the air raids and we'd listen to Big Bertha fire, and I really believed that we were safe. I'm ashamed to remember that when I came back, I was aware of the cramped and at times not too clean household that I had returned to. I was back home with my family, but I was back home with people who were not afraid to give cuddles and love, even though Mum and Dad did not get on that well. They both gave me plenty of tactile attention. I'm now 82, and no doubt I embarrass those I truly care for by my tactile approaches. All of this I learned at my mother's knee. Being with my family did not always seem such a great idea, because they laughed at me because I was now speaking with a Cheshire twang instead of everybody else's London accent. We moved into a bigger flat in Salisbury Road in Haringey, Salisbury Mansions. Just on the St Anne's Road, it had a very long passage and a very big kitchen cum dining room. There was a main bedroom for Mum and Dad and a small bedroom for me. John slept in the front room on a sofa bed. And at last we had a bathroom, but we didn't have a hand basin. Dad put a board over the bath and covered it with oilcloth, and Mum put a big enamel bowl there for us to wash. We still had cold water, except in the winter when the coal fire was on, when we had the luxury of hot water. In the summer months, Mum filled a pan full of water and heated it up on the cooker. Then it was carried along the passage to the bathroom and poured into the bath. This would be a health and safety officer's nightmare. Until I left home to get married in 1954, that was how we obtained our bath water. Mostly we went to the bathhouse in Conway Road that I wrote of earlier. The schools were opened later on, but for quite a while I did not go to school. I just played out on the streets and the local parks with all the other brought-home children. Unofficially returned children were forgotten for a time. Mum had just brought me home and not told anybody that she had collected me or anything, because she was absolutely fed up with the whole situation there. But anyway, we were forgotten. For a while, the education authorities also didn't realise we were home, and so no school places were available. No wonder I still can't multiply or divide. Still to this day, I do not understand numbers. I never will understand numbers, but I'm very good with words. There were no cars about, so playing in the road was normal. We got into all kinds of scrapes and I became a tomboy. There were many games of cricket and football were played in St Anne's Road by the boys. Girls were invited to play, but just someone to run after the ball or stand in the goal between the two old jumpers. The girls mainly stuck to hopscotch, skipping and spinning tops. Knock down ginger, knocking on people's doors and running away was very popular. The park keeper would chase us and grumble about our bad behaviour. Walking up the slide and 3 on a swing were his pet hates. We called him Parky, and heaven only knows what he called us. I believe we gave him a bad time. No school, parents at work, we had all day to run wild, and that is just what we did. No arithmetic lessons, which I now regret. Chestnut Park was a great playground to us all. Boys and girls, so inevitably we had games of kiss chase. Interest in boys seemed a fun thing to discover. What about the fact that we invented doctors and nurses in the bushes? No wonder old Parky kept a strict vigil. We used to dare each other to go to the local convent in St Anne's Road, ring the convent bell till a nun's head appeared in the little hole in the wall, when we would then all run away, and I do hope that they forgave us in their prayers. We were very scared of the nuns and thought they were black penguin ladies. Dad had an allotment in Chestnut Park, which is just off St Anne's Road and Black Boy Lane. Everybody was told they had to dig for victory, and many parks were taken up with allotments. Children had to do chores, and there was no pocket money. I weeded and watered, collected lettuces or cabbages in a string bag for supper. This was my job. Every child had to do a chore then. I then had to go to Parky's office and show him the allotment number, which he could then open up the gate. No one went on the allotments without his permission, adult or child, which was safeguard for the precious crops saved from being stolen. Dad's allotment number was written on my arm in indelible pencil because I couldn't remember numbers. To face Parky for entry to the allotment and pretend that it wasn't me he chased off the slide during the morning took more than a bit of bravado. The East End children played on bombed out houses and collected shrapnel, etc. But we had a park and we became the Chestnut Park Gang. Dad shared his allotment with a family in the next road to us. Ted and Elsie Bye became lifelong friends to my parents, and after my parents had died, I still wrote to them. Uncle Ted lived to be 95 years old and was blind at the end of his life. I remember them with great affection and the Saturday evenings Mum and Dad spent in their house playing cards. Auntie Elsie often looked after me when Mum was at work. Friends of Mum looked after me, for always my mum had to work because my dad could not earn very much. One of her friends was a Mrs. Debney, who had a daughter named Ivy. Ivy had a boyfriend away at war. Ivy had a son called Ronnie. He was my age. We were great pals. Maybe he was even my very first boyfriend. At that time, to be an unmarried mother was quite a stigma, and Mrs. Debney and Ivy coped with it. Ronnie's father was posted as missing and presumed dead. I was with them when the telegram boy came. Ivy was crying, and so was Ronnie, although he had told me before that he couldn't really remember what his dad looked like. When the war ended, news came that his dad had been wounded, captured, and imprisoned in a German prisoner of war camp. Great rejoicing when he came home, when he and Ivy were married. Ronnie became Ronnie Putt instead of Ronnie Debney, and they moved into one of the very first prefabricated houses that were built in West Green Road. They were really very lucky to have such a lovely, nice place to live. The prefabs were supposed to be going to last for 10 years, but there are still some in use now. My mum was really impressed with their prefab. There was a fridge in the kitchen. What a luxury. Modern Formica kitchen units. Miracle of miracles, they had an electric cooker and a bathroom with hot and cold running water. Wow. Ivy let our family have a bath occasionally in their posh bathroom, and my mum thought she was in heaven. They had 2 more children after they moved into their new home, and when Mrs. Debney moved from London to Southend, she invited me to stay with her at the seaside for a few days, and Ronnie was there too. The first day that I attended Downhill Central School in September 1947, what a surprise to see Ronnie in the same class. We told all our school friends that we were cousins, and I can't remember why we did that. We were very, very close friends as younger children, but we drifted apart during our years at Downhills. I suspect our interests were much different, and certainly he was not interested at all in joining the gymnastic club that I adored. He eventually immigrated to Australia, and we lost touch for many years until we had contact through the miracle of the internet, through friends reunited, when we exchanged many messages. He had returned to England and married here, and he lived in Devon with his wife and children. His wife posted a message to me when he died during 2009. God bless you, Putty. We had some good times. Yeah. Air raids. We had a Morrison shelter in my parents' bedroom. The Morrison was an iron cage with wire around it, and I wonder how it arrived at our flat or who put it together. Worse nightmare than a modern flat-back furniture, I expect. It was quite large and made of iron riveted together with some kind of way. My dad put a mattress in it so my brother and I could sleep with some safety during the blitz nights. If the raid was heavy, Dad would drag any stranded passers-by indoors to get under there with us. That was a strange event, and at times really hilarious for John and I. We lost sleep, but in any case, when you have raids, they keep you awake. In the flat above lived the Brown family, and they also had a Morrison shelter in the flat's front room. Our front room was hardly used, except at Christmas. Mum had her cut glass proudly arranged on a sideboard. There was a billiard table in there, and Dad and John used to play snooker there with Uncle Ted. John slept in the put-you-up sofa in the front room when the all clear sounded. He must have wanted some privacy. Anderson shelters were dug out of the earth and then covered with earth. They used to fill up with water in poor weather and were cold and damp. Mum and I slept in one. We went to stay overnight with Uncle Ted and Auntie Elsie. Uncle Ted covered their shelter with earth and bricks, and he made a little garden on top. It smelt of earth and damp, was dark, and had creepy crawlies. There were jars and tins of foodstuff and thermos flasks with cocoa in to drink, but a bit like camping, but without the fun element. There were books and sewing and knitting. Mum did not knit, but she could crochet, all sorts of household linen. The entire curtains in the flat were made by my mum with the fine crochet thread. Pity I did not ask her to make me anything for my home when I got married. It would have been nice to have had a memento of her crochet work. Mum and May were taught to crochet by the nuns in Ireland. Mum and Dad, Uncle Ted and Auntie Elsa were often talking about going to the tube station at Manor House to sleep, saying it would be safer. We were warm in our iron cage, but what if we had been trapped in there? What if a bomb had demolished our block of flats? We would have been right at the bottom, as we were ground floor, and there were 2 more floors above us. Only now do I shudder with what if. There was an incendiary bomb which did set alight the roof of our block, and firemen had to use their hoses and drenched all of Mrs. Benjamin's top floor furniture flat. It was quite exciting for all of us, because these things seem to be when you're young and you haven't any real awareness of danger. I'd almost forgotten all about gaslighting. There were 4 gas mantles in the front room, 2 in the passage, 2 in Mum and Dad's bedroom, and 1 in my little bedroom off the passage. We had 2 gas mantles in the kitchen, 1 in the scullery. In the kitchen living room, where we mainly stayed, there was a dresser and the fireplace and a food cupboard. The TG gas cooker was in the room. Also the coal cellar, which, no kidding, was in the cupboard right next to the cooker. The coal man made a terrible mess down the passage and into the room as he tipped the dusty coal into the cellar. How did my mum keep so cheerful? We did not have electricity put into the flat until after the war ended. Today we switch everything on and off so easily. There was no electric hoover to clean up after, no electric washing machine, no electric tumble dryer, no microwave, no mixer, no this, no that. How did she manage? Even the wireless was valve or battery. We used an awful lot of candles. I remember lots of different candlestick holders. The special candle holders that you use to light yourself to bed were like a dish with a handle, like a teacup. They were made of blue enamel. It's funny now, candles are so fashionable. When we found them a bit eerie and spooky. My dad had candles all along the top of the Morrison shelter and matches always at the ready. We all had a torch, very good to read comics under the bedclothes. And I still have a torch by my bed. I always like to have my torch with me when I go on holiday. And I feel lost without a torch nearby at bedtime. The provision of home shelters just seemed to happen. Every household had to have some form of shelter by the 11th of June 1941. We had a long tunnel under the flat's entrance to Salisbury Mansions, originally so all the residents of the flats could get to the yard and use the stone wash house and the clotheslines. The council men came. They inspected the passageway to see if it would conform to an air raid shelter requirement. And later on it had a big shelter written on the entrance, but was not used as a shelter as far as I know. The Morrison kept you indoors and in the warm, and somehow I felt safer indoors. The Anderson was a good hiding place for all the cats of the neighbourhood. People who had gardens were able to have Anderson shelters, and they were delivered on open lorries by the dustmen. People used oil lamps in them, which no doubt covered the smell of cats. Next door to us there lived a doctor and his wife, forgotten their names now, and they had an Anderson in their garden for the use of his patients in an emergency. It's a shame I've forgotten their names, as they were very kind to my family, and they gave me a wedding gift when I got married, 2 pillowcases with embroidery on the top. We did not go to his surgery. We went all the way to Lordship Lane and to Dr. Edith Summerskill, who later became a very famous Member of Parliament. All this activity was going on, yet I cannot say I was unhappy as a child. My friends and I had never known any other world. It seemed normal to me to rake the streets freely with my friends during the daytime and hide from Mr. Hitler's bombs at night. And we used to put our fingers across the top of our lips and stick our arms up in the air, and we used to say, "Heil Hitler." Wendy Brown, who lived above us, and I were aware that Gloria Benjamin, who lived in the top flat with her mother and brother David, were Jewish. Mum told me that Mrs. Benjamin and her children had escaped from Europe and that their father had been killed. Many friends had dads reported killed in action, and I was glad my dad was too old to go and be killed in action or missing. I first tasted olives and raw herring roll mop fish upstairs in Mrs. Benjamin's flat with challah bread. They always ate on Friday night, the celebration of Seder or Passover. My friend Sandra Galbier at school was also Jewish and had escaped from France with her family. They all went to shul on a Sunday. We called it the synagogue in Stamford Hill, which was near us. They were the lucky ones. They were the ones who got away. Mrs. Benjamin must have dreaded the Nazis' hatred arriving in England to take them all away. How awful that once in a silly, childish row, I was to say to Gloria, "You Jews killed Jesus." not a good Christian Sunday school thing to say, and I was severely punished by my mum for saying it. Bold children could expect to get a good hiding. Mum being Irish, I was never naughty like other children. I was always bold. You're very bold. Are you very bold? So you are. After that well-deserved and painful lesson, I've always respected the Jewish faith. I was a child saying stupid, childish things at a time when adults knew of the suffering of the Jews under the Nazi regime. It was unfortunate for me that Mum heard I had been so unkind. My brother was very friendly with David and much later on decided he thought he would like to convert to Judaism. So he had Stars of David all up around the front room, sang Jewish songs, and with Hitler's whores just across the channel, I do see why my parents were not too impressed with his decision to stand along the persecuted Jewish nation. He and David used to go to all kinds of places together as they were about the same age, and John had a Jewish girlfriend at that time called Sadie. He did not convert in the end, but he remained a friend with David for many years after that. He just always wanted to be different from others, and he told all kinds of fanciful tales to everyone. Full of the Irish, really, not any Yiddish as far as I can recall. Sadly, John died from blood cancer, and I was honoured to sit beside his hospice bed when he died alongside his sons. My brother's name was John Farnham Blight, which is a family name that many Blight men had. And this Farnham comes through to them because my paternal grandfather's name was Farnham Blight, born in Peters Pool in Guernsey. And the Blights can be traced back in Guernsey back to the census of 1851. John named his first son Gerald Farnham, and Gerald in his turn named his only son Michael Farnham. Guernsey was occupied by the Germans during the war, and my dad always felt that they had been deserted by the British government. The factory where Mum worked at St Anne's Road was called the Ever Ready Factory, and before the war they had made batteries for torches, etc. During the war it was a munitions factory, and Mum worked there doing her best for the war effort. The Ever Ready factory was very near to Woodlands Park School, where I eventually had to attend, and she often came to the railings in her and the school lunchtime to make sure that I was still there, I expect. Going to school had dropped out of my idea of fun after the freedom of no school, open or available. This factory musician's job was her best playing job because of the importance of the factory. One night the factory was bombed. Dad was out on duty as an air raid warden, and John was out because he was a messenger boy for the ARP. When the factory was hit, John hid inside a big bin which was full of sand and used to put out fires, and for ages my dad thought he was missing. We lived just along the road, so the blast caused all of our windows to be blown out, and that night I had wanted to sleep in Mum and Dad's bed and not in the Morrison. Mum would not let me, but she came into the cage with me to keep me company when the raid was on. When the bomb hit the factory, all the windows of our flat blew in, and all the glass cut all the way through the great big fluffy eiderdown that they had on their bed and into their mattress. Glass did not come through the wire of the Morrison cage, but we did get a few cuts. But if I had had my own way, who knows? This incident convinced Dad that Mum and I should go to the Manor House tube station every night, that he and John would come along later in the evening when they were off duty. Mum saved them a space amongst the people lying along the fat platform. The platform had wooden bunk-type shelves for people to sleep on, but those places did go quickly. I remember sleeping on a wooden shelf, but I thought it was almost as bad as the straw mattress in the billet hall, so I preferred to curl up alongside Mum because it felt much safer there on the floor. It was stuffy down in the tube and quite noisy. People snored, people coughed. Trains must have kept on running for a while, but I have forgotten now whether they whooshed through or not. Did we have to pay to shelter? I don't know. Did the underground staff have a special emergency drill to evacuate us in the event of a disaster? Did the escalators work if the station was hit? Did my mum feel despair and anxiety for husband and son above ground in the nightly danger? All unknown, but I, as all children, just trusted all would be okay as long as Mum was alongside. I remember there was a big metal canister arrangement surrounded with a canvas screen that was used as a toilet. Mum always tried to make sure our spaces was as far away from it as she could because it did get a bit iffy by the end of the night, and Mum would not allow me to use the communal toilet. "No one's looking at you," she would say in a loud voice. Me, red-faced, sat on a potty that always left big red ridges on my bum. Then, after, she would do this trip to empty it. It did not exactly keep my loo activities secret. After hail, she did guard the little chick very closely, and I was afraid that she would be harmed. How strange we both were. The Manor House tube had its own little concert party, and John and I were part of the entertainment alongside my dad. Dad knew all Stanley Holloway and other monologues, and also knew long pieces from the Charles Dickens novels. He would tell the stories out loud to the people, bits of picnic papers and Great Expectations, and of course my favourite, Oliver Twist. I would sit on Dad's knee and pretend to be Charlie McCarthy, who was a very popular ventriloquist doll at that time. Then Dad would then talk at me and tell jokes as if it was from me. It was all very impromptu. Dad was very good at entertaining, and he loved the English language in every form, and he taught me so much. And I thank his memory for being so strict in making me think how to form my ideas and how to use humour and happier thoughts when in times of sadness and pain. I remember the joy of making people laugh. Maybe the jokes were a bit risque. I wouldn't have known. I wonder when we got to sleep, and there seemed to be so much going on. My brother John sang That Old Black Magic That Has You in Its Spell and Old Man River, especially the line, Lucky old sun has nothing to do but roll around in heaven all day. At his funeral, he requested that record to be played, and I mourned him and all we had experienced in the days when our family were close to each other, because you cannot get closer than huddled together on the floor of a tube station. Lionel Blair and his sister were part of the entertainment group, and also Michael Burney Winters. We younger ones were called the juveniles, and we sang Happy Days Are Here Again because the juveniles are here again, under the direction of Lionel Blair. No doubt I was only given little things to do, as I was the youngest. I have joked since Michael Burney and Lionel and Helen Blair went on to stardom, while John and I went into complete obscurity. There was a lady, she played the accordion for us to sing and dance to, and all this took ours and others' minds off of what we might find when we emerged into the daylight. Many times people told of finding their homes bomb damaged or even demolished. My dad had often to help dig people out of bombed out houses when he was in the auxiliary fire service. Despite all his handicaps, he struggled always to do his bit. We had to leave the station very early in the morning so that people could get onto the tube trains and go to work. We had a long walk home loaded with pillows and blankets and thermos flasks, and I was very embarrassed to have to carry my white and blue enamel potty for everyone to see. When the doodlebugs bombs, often called buzz bombs, arrived, it was a terrible change in the onslaught of terror from the skies, because you heard the buzz bomb overhead night and day, and when the engine stopped a little while later, you heard the explosion. No time for air raid warnings, no time for shelters. And Mum would say, "Get under the table," then drop to her knees and recite the prayer of her youth. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, protect us now in the time of our death. Amen." This sudden, strange behaviour in my strong, energetic mother was a bit more frightening to me than the arrival of any bomb. After the explosion sounded, she would alter her prayer to, "Heaven help those poor old souls, and thank God it was not us." The only real prayer I ever knew her to utter, but God works in mysterious ways and answered the prayer of a poor frightened lapsed Catholic mother. The buzz bomb was the German secret weapon, but it was followed soon after by the V2 rocket. This was more devastating and frightening. This had no sound at all. It was just an explosion. On one occasion, I had been playing out and I'd got very dirty, spent a lot of time getting dirty, very dirty, climbing into one of my friend Renee Keylock's coal bunker so that I could get our ball out. Mum had asked me to run up to the end of the road to the tobacconist's cabin and get her some Woodbine cigarettes. They sold cigarettes to children then. My dad had heard from a friend that a rocket had dropped near Haringey Arena, and we lived near Haringey Arena, so he rushed home. When he saw me, street urchin, dirty with coal dust, and he found me, he hugged me and cried, and he said, "Is your mother all right? Is your mother all right?" Because he thought I'd just come out of a bombing because I was so dirty. Renee and I used to stand outside the local flea pit, which was called the Coliseum, and it was nicknamed the Collie, and ask anyone going in to an A film, "Can you take us in, mister?" Imagine the danger we were in. Dad was really cross when he found out, and he banned me from playing with her. I think now that was a bit unfair on Renee, as I had by that time become very streetwise and was more likely to have been leading her astray and not the other way around. And just like Ronnie Putt, I met up with Renee again on the day that I started at Downhill Central School. Mr. Churchill, our Prime Minister, was urging everyone to carry on the fight against Nazi oppression, but he was in an underground bunker in London, which was the War Office. My dad was very keen on Mr. Churchill, and he used to quote his speeches. "We will fight them on the beaches, never in the field of human conquest has so much been owed by so many, by so few, etc. Oh, he did like the good use of his native language, did Dad. My children for whom this ramble is dedicated may be interested to know that as a youngster I was encouraged to read by my dad Darwin's Origin of the Species and the other books my dad decided I should read. I picked up that the workers have nothing to lose but their chains, and there is nothing to fear but fear itself, and, best of all, laugh and the world laughs with you, cry but you cry alone. That got me through some tough times. Thanks, Dad. My brother John tried to join the Marines, but was turned down as he was not A1 fit. At the time, he was doing demolition work on bombed out houses, and that was a reserved occupation. He did do a great job helping the local ARP as messenger boy, and was pleased when he was promoted to be an air raid warden. He had a helmet, like in the picture, with a rattle. Dad had nice curly hair, and I used to comb it and generally fuss around his hair, and this often put him to sleep. One night, I decided to put Dad's hair in Mum's dinky curlers, and I went to bed, and I missed all the fun, but I got to know about it when he awoke. Dad decided that John was out much too late, so he put on his cap and he went off out to find out where John had got to. He went to the office of the wardens and I suppose grumbled at the man in charge. And when he got home and he looked in the mirror, he had the shock of seeing what the wardens had all seen. He'd taken off his cap and his hair was full of silver dinky curlers. Family joke at his expense ever after that. Victory in Europe and the end of the war for us in 1945 was a great happiness all round. Mum arranged a party for the children of our flats in our backyard, and what a feast we all had. She went round all the neighbours and collected spare food coupons so we could have a good time. So many food coupons donated gave us such a lovely lot of things to eat. It was a treat then to have a jelly even. The men of the flats put up the flags, streamers, and people brought their spare chairs and tables into our yard. The Morrison was put out in the yard and covered with Union Jacks, and we all got up on it and used it as a stage, singing and dancing. Gloria had a really lovely voice, and she sang solo, and the grown-ups all clapped. Later on, she sang with a dance band and went on tour with them. There was a lemonade and cream soda and Tizer for us children, and beer for the men and sherry for the ladies. Women did not drink much other than sherry, but my mum could put on quite a sing-song too, and dance on a few bowls gins, and liked to have the odd Guinness. But then, bless her, she was Irish. Austerity, rationing coupons, both for food and clothing, stayed with us for a very long time. We made do with things and did not throw things away. Everything was making do and mend. Now we live in a take-away, throw-away time, and I think much we have to be thankful for, and how much that generation missed out on. They made sacrifice each and every day, and that is hard to explain that the young ones today. Writing this down has stirred in me so many half-forgotten memories that have been buried with the passing years, and I hope all I have managed to dig out will pass on to family members as an understanding of the past. My first marriage sadly ended after 25 years. but most of that marriage was good, and I'm happy that my relationships with my in-laws remain strong and loving until the end of Laura and John Prickett's lives. Always I am glad at their acceptance of me as a second daughter. They welcomed Tom when he and I married in June 84. This was hard for them, I do know. Laura Fowler, my ex-sister-in-law, remains a true sister to me and reminds me so strongly of her mother in many ways and not only in looks. Her husband Ken and I have always enjoyed each other's company for many years. My son Steve has a constant jovial outlook, has flamboyant love of self-decoration in tattoo design, has motorcycle mania that stayed strong with him from his first Yamaha moped at 16 to the huge Harley Davidson he rides now. In his 50s it takes him to his biker heaven, the Boers Motorcycle Club, runs both here and in Austria and Belgium. That biker interest and his wife Paula rate as his priorities in life. Not a frequent visitor to his mum, but always makes me laugh, and I accept I do not own my children or the way they run their lives. He has become such a close copy of the need to be different that was part of my brother John. My daughter Laura has all the let's put on a show, and my parents would see themselves in her. Her skills in performing on the stage are a source of great pride to me, even more so when I see her 3 children ready and able to take their part alongside her on the stage in village amateur productions. She is my much adored daughter and a dear friend. That need to be different to others I noticed in Steve is matched now by my nephew and my grandson Joe. One day all will admire his artistic creativity as I do now. An independent spirit, he has many irons in his fire, and I wonder at his amazing varied lifestyle. Tears are falling. My eldest granddaughter Fanny and her husband David may see some family traits in their little ones, Alana, Lauren and Martin. I am so proud of the way they love and care for these, my 3 great-grandchildren. My eldest grandson Paul and his wife Sophie may see some traits later in his daughter Caitlin and their little son Lucas Mark, and now their little daughter Olivia. I'm so proud that they have founded another happy little family unit and will cherish these 3 great-grandchildren. My grandson Luke gives a freely tactile affection without embarrassment that I remember receiving from my parents. He again is very much his own person. And as I update this account, he is starting out on his teaching course at Brighton University, and I know he will make a wonderful teacher. My granddaughter Georgia's dogged loyalty to her horse riding and all the hard work that looking after her pony entails shows me a strong little character who will never give up on something she has started. Her ability to dismiss fashion in favour of disorder reminds me of myself when I was a dedicated young gymnast, and her ambition to work in animal welfare is strong and unwavering. My granddaughter Eloise may become proficient in Irish dancing because she has been telling me that she does go to Irish dancing classes, and her Irish ancestry will guide her steps, but I suspect she will move along towards riding a motorbike like her dad. I'm very proud to have been blessed in my lifetime with great-grandchildren. All my children, their children and their children's children will have a spirit that flows through their veins, and it comes from a family of ordinary, brave, hard-working people called the Blights, but they also carry the Prickett family genes, giving the ability to go for what is wanted in life no matter what. Time has gone on through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and I find myself in the 21st century with an ability to use a computer and use my old skills of touch typing despite not having mastered how to keep paragraphs in control. I have got some of my young life down as best as memory allows. Some dates may be out of order, some memories sharper than others, but hopefully interesting to read. The only way for my children and grandchildren to know that side of the family is really in these scribbling downs of memories, and as they return to me before memory fades as years roll on. I leave off in 1945, end of wartime, but it was also the start of a nation struggling against the enormous debt to the Americans, which took many years to repay. The time was called the years of austerity, and I will continue to write all I can of that time and my teenage years in the swinging 50s and 60s. The end.